There is one ingredient that is in pretty much everything we eat these days that lights up the same reward centres in the brain as cocaine, that the food industry has spent billions and billions of pounds engineering into our food supply to make sure we never stop wanting more of it. And most people consuming it every day have absolutely no idea about any of this. And that ingredient obviously is sugar. And this is what it does to your body. So you've just eaten something sweet. Maybe it was a biscuit or a cookie or a can of Coke or a donut. Maybe it was a cereal bar that you thought was healthy. Or maybe it didn't taste sweet at all. Maybe it was a bag of crisps or some chips or a sandwich or a bowl of pasta. Because this video isn't really just about sugar, it's actually about refined carbohydrates, which is what most of the ultra-processed food that we eat every single day is actually made of, which does pretty much the same thing to your body as sugar does. And in the next 60 minutes after eating any of it, your blood sugar is going to spike, your insulin is going to surge, your liver may start converting that excess sugar into fat, and before that hour is even up, most of us are already craving more of it. That cycle, repeated multiple times every day for years, is one of the main drivers behind this epidemic of insulin resistance and fatty liver and type 2 diabetes and heart disease that I spend my career in emergency medicine dealing with the consequences of all the time. So I'm going to tell you exactly what's happening inside your body during these 60 minutes. Some of it is completely normal, but some of it is genuinely quite alarming. And I'm also going to talk about something that doesn't get anywhere near enough attention, which is why sugar is actually addictive in a neurological sense and how the food industry has deliberately exploited that. I'm saving this for the end of the video because once you've seen the full picture, it lands completely differently with most people. So stay with me if you want to hear about that. So I've spent the last 10 years working in emergency medicine in the UK, in the NHS. And what I keep seeing again and again are people arriving with problems that didn't start that day. They started years or decades earlier, very quietly and very slowly, very often one meal at a time. And we're talking about the things that kill us most often, so heart disease and type 2 diabetes and kidney failure and certain cancers as well. Conditions that looked very sudden at the time, but again had been building for years in the background for over a decade, driven by the same underlying process, which is a metabolic system that had been slowly overwhelmed, meal after meal, without anybody ever explaining to these people what was actually happening inside their body. And the thing that frustrates me more and more, the longer I work in emergency medicine, and the reason why I started this channel, is just how preventable most of these deaths are. Most of the food that we eat these days, our grandparents wouldn't recognize as food. This is a very strange world we live in these days. So I'm really hoping you find these videos useful. If you do, then please like them and subscribe to the channel, and I will keep giving you all of this information, everything I know, to help you live longer. So when most people think about sugar, we think about table sugar, the white stuff, the stuff you put in your tea. But sugar is actually a family of molecules that includes glucose and fructose and sucrose and lactose. These are all sugars, and they behave very differently in the body. The one that matters most for this conversation is glucose, because glucose is your body's primary fuel. Your brain runs on it, your muscles use it, your red blood cells basically only use glucose. So glucose isn't the enemy, glucose, keeps you alive, literally. The problem isn't glucose existing in your body, the problem is what happens when too much of it arrives too quickly, too often. And that's where refined carbohydrates come in, because they are basically sugar in disguise. So we're talking about things like white bread, white rice, most breakfast cereals, and crackers and crisps and pastries, most packaged snacks, to be honest. These are foods where, the fiber and the structure, the matrix of that food has been stripped away, which means they digest extremely fast and they dump glucose into your bloodstream almost as quickly as table sugar does. Your body can't really distinguish between the sugar in a can of Coke or in sliced white bread. The packaging is different, but the biology is pretty much identical. Think of it like water. You need water, but if somebody opens a fire hose into your kitchen, well, that's not hydration, that is a disaster. It's the same substance, but it's a different amount and a completely different story, if any of that makes sense. The thing is, even if you are somebody who reads the food labels, who checks the sugar content, who puts something back on the shelf because the sugar content looks a bit too high, you are probably still being lied to. You are being misled because some of the most glycemic ingredients in the modern food industry aren't listed as sugar at all. We're talking about maltodextrin or modified food starches. Maltodextrin is one of the most common ones. It is a highly processed starch derived from corn or wheat or rice. And it is used absolutely everywhere in things like protein powders, in flavored crisps, in instant soups, in sauces, in low-fat products, meal replacement bars, things that we think are healthy, but they're really not. It doesn't read as sugar on the label, but these modified food starches like maltodextrin have a really high glycemic index, which is higher than table sugar, sometimes twice as high. It's absorbed into your bloodstream faster than almost anything else you can eat, and it produces a glucose spike that rivals or exceeds a can of Coke. Now, dextrose, which is basically just another name for glucose, is used really commonly as a sweetener and a filler, and it digests almost instantaneously. What I'm saying here is that these big food corporations, the food industry, is very aware that consumers like you and me have become more label conscious, and the response has been to formulate products that keep the sugar numbers low on the nutrition panel while packing them with ingredients that behave identically to sugar once they are inside your body. That is not right. So a food can be labelled as no added sugar on the front and be full of maltodextrin, which produces a bigger glucose spike than something full of sugar. So a protein bar could look completely clean on the label, but actually spike your glucose harder than a Mars bar or a Snickers. This is not just a technicality, it is a deliberate exploitation of the gap between what the label says and what the biology actually does. The sugar content on the nutrition label tells you one part of the story. The ingredients list tells you another part of the story. So if you see maltodextrin or modified starches or dextrose or glucose syrup or corn syrup in the first several ingredients of anything, then your body is going to treat it like sugar because physiologically it is sugar. So the second that food hits your mouth, digestion begins. Your saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which starts breaking down carbohydrates immediately before you've even swallowed it. So if you're drinking something sugary or eating something highly processed with very little fiber to slow things down, or something containing maltodextrin or modified starches that your label told you is fine, glucose hits your bloodstream really fast. We're talking maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes from the first bite. With whole foods, something that still has its fiber and its matrix intact, it takes significantly longer, and that delay matters enormously. So picture your blood a bit like a river, and glucose is basically like the cargo being loaded onto that river. Now, normally there is a very steady and manageable flow, but when you eat a lot of fast digesting carbohydrates, you're loading a massive amount of cargo all at once, and your body detects this almost immediately. There are sensors in your small intestine, literally like little sensors in the cells, actually even in your mouth as well, that start sending signals before the glucose is even fully absorbed. Your body is already preparing a response. And the main thing it prepares is a hormone that almost everybody has heard of, but most people don't fully understand. And I bet you can guess what it is. Yes, it's insulin. So about 15 minutes in, sometimes sooner, your pancreas starts releasing insulin into your bloodstream. So your pancreas sits behind your stomach, and most people never really think about it. It's a bit of an unexciting organ, but it is doing one of the most important jobs in your entire body every single day without you ever noticing it. So insulin is essentially like a key, and it unlocks the doors on your cells and lets glucose inside. So when it's working perfectly, the sequence goes: glucose arrives in your blood, your pancreas releases insulin, insulin unlocks your cells, glucose moves in, and then your blood glucose level comes back down. It's really elegant, it's efficient, and it works really well in most people. But the size of the insulin response depends entirely on how much glucose arrived and how fast it got there. So a piece of fruit, a piece of whole fruit, which comes packaged with fiber and this really complicated structure, that slows digestion down. It produces a very moderate, gradual rise. But a can of Coke or a bowl of cornflakes or Frosties or Cocoa Pops or a couple of slices of white toast or a protein bar full of maltodextrin, that is a flood of glucose into your bloodstream, and your pancreas has to respond really hard and fast. And that is what we call this big insulin spike. By 30 minutes in, your blood glucose level is at or near its peak. Now, for most healthy adults, your blood glucose after a meal sits somewhere around 7 to 8 millimoles per litre, which is roughly 126 to 145 in the US units. That is the normal post-meal range, and it's completely fine. But if you've eaten a lot of fast-digesting carbohydrates or sugar, whether it's the obvious sugar in your food or something that looks healthy, it can spike this considerably higher. And high blood glucose isn't just a number on a chart, it is physically damaging to the tissues that it flows through. So glucose at high concentrations is sticky. It literally adheres and sticks to proteins in the blood and to the walls of your blood vessels in a process called glycation. And it triggers something called oxidative stress, which is essentially chemical damage at the cellular level. Now, the phrase "sugar ages you" sounds like something from a wellness Instagram account, but it actually has some really solid biology behind it. One of the proteins that glucose actually sticks to is something called collagen, which I'm sure you've heard of, the thing that keeps your skin firm, your joints flexible, and your arteries supple and elastic. Now, repeated spikes over time, over years, well, that damage accumulates. The small blood vessels in your body are obviously the most vulnerable ones. So we're talking about the ones in your eyes, your kidneys, and the nerve endings in your feet and hands. This is why we see diabetic patients in the A&E who are losing their sight, who have no feeling in their feet, who need dialysis, not because of one bad meal, but because of years of these glucose spikes quietly doing this damage. At around the 45-minute mark, something really important happens. Now, for a lot of people, your blood glucose level starts to fall. Insulin has done its job, and glucose has been cleared into your cells, mostly your muscle and your liver cells. And the levels in the blood are coming down nicely. But there's a catch. Sometimes insulin can overshoot. If the spike was really large, then your pancreas responds proportionally hard. And sometimes that insulin is so effective, it brings your blood glucose down below where it started. This is what we call reactive hypoglycemia. And it is much more common than most people realize. So you've almost certainly felt this, even if you didn't know what it was. So you eat something really sugary or starchy, you feel okay, maybe even get a bit of a lift, and then 45 minutes or an hour later, you feel really tired, you feel a bit foggy, a bit irritable, maybe a bit shaky, and weirdly hungry again, even though you ate just 45 minutes ago. Well, that is very often reactive hypoglycemia. Your blood sugar dropped, and your brain, which is completely dependent on glucose and doesn't really tolerate low levels well, is telling you to fix it. And what does it want? Well, more sugar, something really fast, something really easy that gets glucose back into your bloodstream. So this isn't really a willpower problem. This isn't a character flaw. This is just pure hardcore biology. Your brain doesn't really care about your diet. It cares about glucose because that is the energy that it uses. And when your glucose levels drop, it sends very powerful signals that are really difficult to ignore. And this is one of the main reasons why refined carbohydrates and sugar are so hard to stop overeating. The food creates the craving. You have a spike, and then a crash, and then a craving, and then another spike. A loop that the food industry didn't just anticipate, they designed for it. And that brings me back to the thing that I'd said I'd come back to. By 60 minutes, your blood glucose is usually heading back towards baseline. And for a healthy person, this whole process resolves fairly quickly. But something has been happening in the background throughout all of this that most people never think about, which is your liver. While that spike was happening and insulin was surging, your liver was also receiving glucose the entire time. And glucose that arrives at the liver doesn't automatically get stored away tidily. If glycogen stores are already full, which they often are in people who eat a lot of carbohydrates and don't move much, the liver converts the excess sugar into fat, specifically a type of fat called triglycerides, which it then packages up and then releases into your bloodstream. Now, this process is called de novo lipogenesis, which just means making new fat from starch. And a significant proportion of that fat doesn't end up under your skin, it goes directly back into the liver itself, quietly accumulating over months and years. And this is how fatty liver develops. Not from eating dietary fat, but from eating too much refined carbohydrates and sugar too often without burning it off. A liver that accumulates fat becomes less sensitive to insulin, which means you need more insulin to do the same job, which means the pancreas has to work harder. And over time, the whole system starts to break down. Now, this is the very slow and silent path towards type 2 diabetes for most people. It's not just one can of Coke, it is years of this cycle, often driven by ingredients that the person never really knew was in their food. Now, sugar, as I've mentioned, is addictive in a really measurable neurological sense that has been documented again and again in really serious peer-reviewed research. What we see in brain imaging is that sugar activates the dopamine reward pathway, the same pathway activated by cocaine, nicotine, and alcohol, producing this really big surge of dopamine in the brain's reward center. And critically, like other addictive things, repeated exposure to sugar leads to tolerance. The dopamine response diminishes over time, which means you need more sugar to get the same effect. You crave more, you consume more, and the reward gradually decreases while the consumption to seek it increases. From the 1970s onwards, following the low-fat dietary guidelines that swept through these Western governments, the food industry faced a big problem. When you remove fat from food, it tastes terrible in most cases, so they replaced it with sugar, with refined carbohydrates, with maltodextrin and other modified starches and glucose syrups and these other industrially formulated combinations to hit what food scientists call the bliss point, the precise combination of ingredients that maximizes palatability and minimizes the feeling of fullness so that you keep eating past the point that your body would naturally stop. Michael Moss, which some of you may have heard of, has actually documented this really well in his book, which is called Salt, Sugar, Fat. And these former food industry insiders have since spoken out really openly about the fact that addictiveness was not an unintended side effect of the product development. In many cases, it was a design goal. The result has been one of the most consequential and quietly catastrophic public health shifts in modern history. In 1980, roughly 5% of the global population had type 2 diabetes. Today, that figure is over 10% and rising. And behind it is a much larger number of people with insulin resistance and fatty liver and metabolic dysfunction who haven't yet crossed the diagnostic criteria but are still well on their way. We spent decades telling people that fat was the big problem, that fat was the enemy. You know, low-fat yogurts, low-fat ready meals, low-fat everything, all of this was meant to be good for us. And what filled that gap was the actual driver of this crisis. We're talking about sugar and refined carbohydrates and starches and maltodextrin, all the things that don't show up as fat on the label and don't always show up as sugar either. It was the wrong conversation, and we are still living with the consequences and will do for many decades. Now, none of this is about making anybody feel anxious or, making people think that bread is poison and you should never eat it again. Everything described in this video is normal physiology working exactly as it should. The issue isn't the physiological system. The issue is the volume and the frequency of what we're asking the body to handle. Research consistently shows that close to half of adults in the Western world have some degree of insulin resistance, and most of them have never been told because it doesn't get a formal diagnosis until it progresses to full type 2 diabetes. And again, a lot of people will never really go to their doctor about this sort of thing, so they'll never get the diagnosis. Our grandparents didn't really go to the gym because they didn't need to. They moved constantly throughout their daily life. They built muscle naturally just by existing in the world, and that muscle acted as a buffer, absorbing the glucose before it could do any damage. We've lost that buffer completely without realizing it, and we've replaced it with a food environment full of ingredients that are quietly doing damage to our bodies, that were designed by scientists to override your body's natural satiety signals and keep you eating. And this is a really, really important concept that not many people really fully understand. Now, this video is really just about the mechanism and the physiology of what happens when you eat sugar. There is loads more advice in my other videos about how to reduce your glucose spike, but let me just give you a few tips here. The big glucose spike and everything that follows after it can be dramatically reduced with just a few simple things. The first one is to never eat refined carbs or sugar on an empty stomach. Having protein and fiber before the sugary or starchy things slow digestion and dramatically reduce the spike that follows. The order that you eat your food really does matter. The other thing to do is to walk after you eat, even just 5 or 10 minutes. Your muscles are taking up glucose during that movement and act as the buffer that your body is designed to have. The other thing to do is to try and remove liquid sugar out of your diet. So we're talking about fizzy drinks and fruit juices and sweetened coffees, because liquid fructose hits the liver faster than almost anything else and is the most efficient driver of triglyceride production that we know of. So those are just a few really easy things that you can start with if you're interested in this sort of thing. Like I said, there are lots of other videos on the channel that you can watch to give you a bit more detail on the habits that will help with your glucose spikes. I really hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if there are other things that you want me to focus on in the future, and have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.